What I'd like to do in this video is to review what we've done in the past three videos, that is the global changes, broad changes, and the local changes on an image that is perhaps a little bit more interesting than the one that we have been working on. So I've picked an image here which I think has some potential. We can definitely enhance some of the properties in the sky. We can try to make that rainbow look a little bit better. We can try to enhance these windmills in the background and perhaps create a little vignette around here to keep our center of interest in the center of the image rather than kind of moving out on the bottom edges. So to do that really quickly, we'll just go very quickly through some global changes, some broad changes, and local changes. But I want to end up with this video having different layers. And then what I want to do is I want to go from these layers that we have created in the basic protocols and then look at those layers and say, you know, how can we do this better? And so we want to actually go from our basic protocols to our next step, which is the adjustment layers, and that's going to be our next video. So to begin with, let's just quickly look at this image. And again, always we want to look at image size, have a look at this, find out what we're working with. It looks like a reasonable image that we can print if we wanted to. So 300 by 12 by 9 makes a nice enlargement. We could work with that. If we go into adjustments and then go into levels, we're going to look at levels for a second here and ask ourselves, like, what can we enhance here? We definitely always want to make sure that we've got a nice black here and our white is okay here, and we can look at this image here, or actually when I mean image, I'm always confused sometimes. Like when I say image, I'm actually looking at my histogram and I'm saying to myself, like, can I lighten some of these areas in the sky and then maybe add some contrast in here to beef up that rainbow. I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But I'm just going to add a little bit of lightness to the sky just so that I can work with that a little bit better. Click OK. If I go to my image and I go to my curves, what I'm going to do with my curves, I'm going to add a little bit of contrast here. So I'm going to put a little toe down here, put a little shoulder up here, like that. And again, I'm just trying to modulate this area in the sky so I can draw out that rainbow a little bit better. Again, I don't want to lose the information down here. Be careful that you're not going to go white here. And that looks pretty good there. Again, I've done a couple of things here. I've actually stacked my history and my layers and my info together. You remember on our very first video where I was talking about like how to have these three palettes. I call them palettes, have them up together. You can kind of make them stick together like that by just sort of moving them and just connecting them, and you'll stack them like that. So I'm going to be working in my layers palette right now, and I have a duplicate, obviously. We always want to have a duplicate. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some other changes that I want to do. I could look at my color balance and change that a little bit. So if I wanted to warm it up just a little bit, add a little bit of red to that, and just to kind of neutralize that blue there, because it just has a tinge of blue to it. Of course, being a storm sky, you're going to get that blue light. Okay, now I just going to get my info palette out here for a minute, put it over here. I'm just going to check these areas in here, use my my move tool here, and I'm just going to check in here to see if I'm not losing information. Again, I'm looking at my RGB values, make sure they're not 255, because that's going to actually have no information in it. That looks okay. It looks like I can still work with information in that area. Okay, so I am going to now move to my broad changes. So in my broad changes, I'm going to do a couple of things here. First of all, I'm going to take the sky area and I'm going to modify that a little bit. So I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to duplicate that layer, and it's going to call it layer, I guess this would be layer 3. Again, you could label these any way you want. I have a background 1 and 3. I guess I could make that 2. While I'm just working on it, it kind of makes sense to me that it's a third layer. Anyway, so I'm going to look at this layer right here, and I'm going to make a change in here. I'm going to take that layer, going to put an adjustment on it, and I'm going to use my curves, and I am going to just make that darker, like that, and add a little contrast to it. Now, that sky looks pretty good, but the foreground looks terrible. So what we're going to do is we're just going to erase that foreground. So we're going to get our erase tool, pick a brush that's a decent size. Again, make sure it's a soft brush, and go in here. We're going to actually just click on there. Make sure that we're not going to do 25% because you really want to get rid of a lot of that, because the colors are pretty bright in there. We don't want them quite that bright. We want to make them look natural, but we do want that sky to be really dramatic. Now, if I wanted just to take a little bit out of that sky, I could take my slider down to 20%, and if I wanted just to lighten up that rainbow just a little bit like that, I could do that. Again, that probably was a bad move right there. I can simply go Edit Undo or Control Z to undo that erase tool, or I could go to my history and say, you know what, I didn't like that, and I didn't like that. So a couple of ways there that you can erase what you've done. Back to my layers palette, you can see I've got 3 layers here. I'm going to do another layer, but this time I'm not going to duplicate the layer. I'm just going to create a new layer, and in this layer I'm going to take my dodge, beg your pardon, my burn tool, and in my burn tool I'm just going to make a very slight vignette around the bottom edges here, so that my bottom area here kind of looks a little darker. Okay, so again, this is a burn tool. I'm going to be looking at maybe changing that to my highlights and just add a little bit of darkness in these highlights. Now, you notice me, I was trying to add some information here and it wasn't happening. And so the reason it's not happening is because I'm trying to burn into a layer that has no information. So to make this actual bottom burn happen here, I actually need to take the whole image and I need to flatten it. So I'm going to flatten that whole image, and what's going to happen is that I have one continuous image, or I've taken all of the layers and combined them into one. Now if I go back in here, you can see that I can very easily create that darkening effect. And the idea here is I want to create some darkening around the edges here so that the center of the image is the center of interest. This lightest part, this area where the rainbow meets the light part here, makes the eye kind of settle into this area right here. So I'm pretty happy with what I've done. They're really pretty dramatic changes, and if I was to really spend a little bit more time, I'd take more effort to make it look a little bit more realistic and less noticeable, but I'm trying to make it visible on the video so you can actually see these changes, so I'm being a little bit more dramatic than I need to be. One of the other things I'm going to do here right now is I'm going to make another couple of local changes in here, and one of the changes I'm going to do is I'm going to use my magnify tool, magnify the area where the windmills are, and I'm just going to select that whole area, use my lasso tool, and just going to select this whole area right here. And I want to do one very simple thing. I just want to add some contrast here. And to do that, I need to select this area, and I can create a feather on that. So, beg your pardon, I'm going to go select feather, and I'm going to modify and put a feather on that selection. If I type in 12, that should be okay. Now all I'm really doing here is I'm making a selection, but I want that selection not to have a hard edge around it. I want to have a soft edge. With that being a soft edge now, I can go back in here and use the same tools I have been using. In this case, if I use levels and I actually take my levels and I can, if you watch the inside of that, you can see what I'm doing. I'm actually changing the effect. If I wanted that to be lighter or darker, I could do that. If I want it to be add a little bit more contrast to that area, I could do that by moving these sliders in a little bit like this and click OK. And let's just have a look at that and see what that looks like. Okay, a little bit noticeable in here, not quite right. Okay, so there's actually a better way of doing that. Now we could have, been a little bit more careful and we could have made that work, but there's actually a better way of doing this. So let's go back to our history. Go back here, undo all of that, what we've just done. And let's use our burn tool this time. And in our burn tool, what we're going to do is we're going to leave it at the highlights. And if I burn this area in here, let me just change my brush size as well. So if I burn in this area right here, I should actually be burning in the darker areas or the lighter areas or the mid-tone areas based on which of these three that I pick. So if I want to burn in the shadows in this area, I would use shadows or the darker area. And if I were to just burn that area in like that, you can see that I'm actually burning that in. I'm burning in the shadows, but I'm leaving the white unchanged. Now obviously that's very dramatic, and I would go back and say, you know what, that's not quite right. So I would just change this a little bit, back that off a bit, go back in here and just very slightly brush over this area to make it look like I'm that may have been a bit much there, but I just want to add some contrast into this area right here. Just going to actually tweak that a little bit better. There we go. That looks good. You can zoom back out. You can push down Alt key with your magnify tool. It will change it to a minus, and you can change it back down to where it was. You're going to have a look at that with our full screen mode just to kind of see what we're looking at. And again, I want that rainbow to be nice and bright. I want these windmills to be a little bit more noticeable. I want my center of attention to be in the center here. And so I'm going to say that looks pretty good. Escape, get back to where we were. Now, I just want to go back to my layers here. If you remember way back when we first started changing this image, we actually had several different kinds of layers here. We actually took our layers and we duplicated the layers a few times. And we did all kinds of things like change this layer by adding more contrast to it. So for example, I could go to levels and make it darker or add more contrast. And we'd use our erase tool to erase part of the foreground. Let's just make sure we're doing that properly. Okay, so I could erase part of that foreground in here. And you can see that, yeah, that really kind of helps our image. If I look at what I've just created here, you can see that I'm actually just adding a little bit more interest to this area down here, keeping the sky nice and dark and so on. Now, wouldn't it be great if I could actually go back into that layer and say, you know what, I wish I could actually add that information back in here. I've taken it out, I've destroyed it. That's called destructive editing. It would be great if I could actually just go back in here and build up that area from the original. But I can't because I've gotten rid of it. So that's called destructive editing, and that's what we've been doing up to this point in time. our next video, what I'm going to show you is how to do this so that you could in fact go back, make changes. If you didn't like them, you could go back and change it again. And that's called non-destructive editing. And that's going to be our next video.